Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, where we help new and beginning teachers navigate through those crazy first years of teaching so you can maintain your sanity and personal life. Here's your host, Kim Lapre.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, episode number 31. I'm your host, Kim Lapre, and this is the podcast for new and beginning teachers who don't want to just survive those first few years, but actually thrive. Thanks for coming out and listening to the show today. I really appreciate you guys coming back every week. And today I have a special guest, Ray Steinmetz, who is a math instructional coach in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. I think I said it right, Portsmouth. In any case, he came on the show to talk to me about all things math. So for those of you that teach math either at the secondary level or as an elementary school teacher, then this is the episode for you. We dive into topics such as how the Common Core is actually a good thing, how drill and kill methods of teaching math are a thing of the past, and how to individualize and personalize learning for your math students so that they can go comfortably at their own pace while still achieving grade level standards. You're going to get so much out of this episode. Ray shares so much about how to teach all kinds of learners in terms of math, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear this. Now, at the end of the episode, I'm going to come back with my key takeaways, so make sure that you listen to the end. But first, I want to let you guys know that I joined a podcast network called the Education Podcast Network. And what this is, it's a network that has about 26 different educational podcasts, all geared with helping teachers become better at their craft and help students. So if you go over to edupodcastnetwork.com, so that's edupodcastnetwork.com, you can find my show as well as 25 other shows from amazing educators. So here's a word from a fellow podcast on the awesome Education Podcast Network.
My name is Dennis Sheeran.
And this is Ray Steinmetz.
And we are from the Instant Relevance podcast. We are proud members of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you are listening to right now. Make sure you check out all of the other great podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com. And get ready, because the learning begins in 3, 2, 1.
Ray, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Could you please tell my listeners more about your teaching experience and how you came to your current position?
I did not begin my career as a teacher. I went to school to be kind of a computer engineer or an IT guy. And I actually, my official degree from Purdue University is computer technology with an emphasis in telecommunications and networking. So I kind of studied a lot about the backbone of the internet, computer security, network security, like firewalls and all that stuff. And I got a good job out of college in Chicago. I started working for a large bank and then worked for another large bank, and I was doing computer security stuff for them. And I absolutely hated it. And, it was a great time being, in a big city after college and everything. But I just really struggled with going in every day and doing something that, one, I had really put a lot of my life into. I mean, I had a degree in it and I was good at it. It was a successful career. I was like 27 at the time and making good money. It didn't really match my personality to sit in a cubicle all day.
Yeah.
And stare at a computer. And it really didn't it wasn't good for mental health. And I really wanted to be involved and, helping people and really doing something that I was proud to say I was doing every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I started volunteering a little bit. I volunteered with a couple organizations. One was youth homelessness outreach volunteers. So, through that work, I really found that, every day I wanted to be helping people.
Right.
So I went through a career-changing program called Chicago Teaching Fellows and became a teacher. I did my student teaching in Cabrini Green. So my first year I taught science, really got my feet wet, but then my position was changed and I taught math. And then my wife and I had our first child and decided she's from Rhode Island to move back to this area of the country. And that was about 4 years ago now. And when we moved back here, I got a really great job at a kind of a small suburban, I want to say maybe even a little rural district on an island in Rhode Island.
Oh,
so
nice.
I got a 7th grade math position when I moved. You know, I was a 7th grade teacher there for the last 3 years until this current school year. This summer, the math instructional coach for the district, that job became available, and I went ahead and jumped on it.
I think it's really interesting that you have this like different perspective, especially because you worked first in technology and then you went through that almost like a boot camp program. So when you switched over from science to math, what did you notice about math now and like the curriculum and how it's taught compared to, you know, like how math was taught when we were in school?
Yeah, so I guess that's like the big thing now. And it's also been very, I don't want to say interesting. It's been a roller coaster ride over the last 10 years teaching math because, you know, when I first started teaching, the Common Core state standards weren't really a thing. People were still kind of dealing with No Child Left Behind and the fact that we were even just testing every year and kind of dealing with the accountability piece, and everybody's kind of freaking out, and schools are closing left and right, and you know teachers are getting fired left and right. And a couple years later, the Common Core state standards came in, and really what the Common Core state standards did was it took a lot of the standards that were traditionally taught in higher grades and really pushed them down. So if you look at like the core of what is taught in K-8 math now in the Common Core state standards compared to what it was, it is way more rigorous and it has way more standards. And like anybody like you or me who, you know, I'm not that far removed from school. I'm in my mid 30s. I can look back at, you know, middle school and high school and I can say, you know what, there's some math in middle school right now with probability that I didn't learn until college. And so they really pushed down and really tried to squeeze as much out of that orange as possible when it came to K-8 mathematics, and really pushing down the standards to lower grade levels than they used to be. So the expectations were much higher. So not only did we just go through this whole round of accountability with even testing kids every year and being held accountable, but now all of a sudden the standards became harder. And so that was a really big transition. A couple years later, those students who started with those standards in kindergarten are now in whatever grade and have been being taught that way for a few years. And after a few years, it's really kind of, you know, made its progression through the multiple different grades. And, you know, it really has made an impact on what students know. I see students rising to the occasion. So even though we were freaked out a couple years ago about the higher standards, it really has progressed through and, you know, improved, or at least, you know, made math learning a way more rigorous. And I think that, you know, from what I've seen, the students have been able to step up to the challenge.
The one thing that I noticed, because my daughter's in 7th grade and I've been watching what she gets for assignments since kindergarten, I noticed that there isn't as much drill and kill. So I remember, you know, doing calculus or trig, and the teacher would assign 1 through 25 evens because the odd numbers, you know, the answers were in the back or something. And now it's not like that. Now they're almost like real world problems, and you don't just sit there and practice the skill over and over again. And I was curious what you thought about that, and if you've seen that to be effective, or is it difficult? Because I know that as a parent, it's difficult for me to help my student, but at the same time, you know, if the kids are getting it, then who cares what I think about it?
Right. Yeah. So I guess the last kind of shift that's been happening recently, kind of, I want to say in the last couple more years with kind of blended learning and kind of this idea of kind of growth mindset. And there's now been this shift again away from the drill and kill and more of the application and more of teaching strategies. There's no one way that everybody's going to do the same math problem. So teaching those strategies so that when a student approaches something in their everyday life or approaches a problem, they're going through those different strategies that they learned, choosing the appropriate one. And even though, for instance, like for multiplication, they might have been taught, maybe 10 different strategies to think about multiplication, really taking that and mastering one of them in their own mind and taking, kind of their own path to understanding. Because there isn't, we all know that drill and kill doesn't work. And what does work is providing those strategies of mind, giving them applications to those strategies, as well as kind of building up their foundation of their number core. All of those things are really what sets students to be successful, because what doesn't work is teaching a student how to do something one way and expecting them to repeat that. Because math really isn't a memorization subject. It really is like a science that should be looking at numbers and data that exist in the real world and be able to apply the strategies of mind and the flexibility of mind to those real world things using our past experiences.
I guess that makes sense, because I remember when I was doing math, like I could do it really well how the teacher showed us in class and how they demonstrated. And then during the test, they would throw in something slightly different and I didn't know how to do it anymore because I only know how to do math one way. And I guess I didn't really understand math. I just knew how to do the steps that the teacher had taught me, and I knew how to do that part perfectly. So I can see how introducing multiple ways at looking at a math problem could help students so that when they apply it to, say, like a real world situation, they have this like toolbox where if it doesn't fit doing math this way or solving it this way, they can try something else.
Right. In doing that, and not that only being like on the problem solving day or you only get that one word problem at the bottom of a test.
Yeah.
The one word problem that you're expected to apply. It's funny, our old math program was like that too. It was like very procedural. And then there was like the chapter ending lesson that was the problem solving. And it's just like, no, this should all be interwoven like the whole time. Like it shouldn't just be, just at the end of the chapter. So, we're taking on a new math program as well that's, less procedural and a little bit more analytical, if you want to put it that way.
So when you see a student who is struggling with a concept and you're not showing them all the steps along the way necessarily, you're showing them different ways, how do you know which part of it that they don't understand? Like if they're just getting the wrong answers, how do you know where the cracks are that, and the gaps that you need to fill?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that really understanding where gaps exist in mathematical understanding is very important. I think that that's a piece that exists in intervention that, we play a lot of guessing games with whether kids understand. And I think that also comes a little bit from the way that math has been taught traditionally, just at the front of the class and with the call and response. There's a lot of guesswork in whether your methods are working or not.
Right.
So, you're up at the front of the class, the 10 students you were able to call on that day know the answer to like the question you asked them on the spot at that exact moment. And then you might give an exit ticket at the end of the class, right? Well, that's not enough formative assessment data. That's not enough formative assessment information to really understand where people are getting tripped up along the way. So kind of changing your classroom into kind of a more blended learning experience where everything becomes a formative assessment that you're doing and everything provides some sort of information to you, and you start teaching less in front of the room and kind of setting this goal to have a one-on-one conversation or like a coaching session, either one-on-one or in a small group with every student in every period. If you set that goal for yourself, you're going to start talking to individual students a lot more often than whole classes. And that's a first step in the direction of understanding where kids are. And so that's the first thing, is the structure of your class needs to kind of be changed if you're expecting to get to know individual students' mathematical knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
You can't expect to stand at the front of the room and really get an idea of what your students know. So that's the first step. And the second step is educate yourself, because there's a lot of research done. I know that RIDE, the Rhode Island Department of Education, has adopted this. It's an Australian framework, and I believe it's called First Steps. And it's like task-based intervention, looking at giving students mathematical tasks and watching them do them to uncover really those foundational gaps in their understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's an intervention, kind of not screening piece, but an intervention like deep digging piece. So it's not an easy task. Like, and every student has their own gaps, and they get kind of cemented over kind of year by year as well. So once you get to somewhere like middle school, that's actually where some of those things are the most powerful, because you have a student who really is struggling with some fraction work. And it's like, okay, let's take a step back. Do you understand multiplication? Have you, mastered your multiplication skills?
Right.
Beyond understanding what multiplication is, have you actually taken the extra step and memorized them? Because, I feel like there's this kind of no one wants to have kids memorize multiplication and division anymore, when, to be honest, the research shows that some sort of once you learn those actual strategies of multiplication, once you know that multiplication is skip counting, and once you can like understand that there's all these strategies like the area model to understand multiplication, there's a certain amount that, okay, you need to know your math facts. And that's something we're looking at as well, is leading up to the grades like 5th, 6th, and 7th grade that do such heavy fraction work. What are we doing to really solidify and make sure that our students, know all of their multiplication and division before we're kind of piling on all this fraction work as well?
So this is somewhat related, but I remember reading a tweet from a math teacher asking, how long do you let the students struggle before you show them how to work out the problem? I mean, basically, do you just sort of let them explore? Do you jump right away to teaching them, the algorithm? How much do you just let them struggle before you jump in? And what has been your experience in terms of, like how much time do you spend in front of the class versus letting them struggle? Right.
So I've actually found there's a lot of people out there who are kind of just throwing kids in the deep end at the beginning, not deep end, but exposing them to the idea, at least through some sort of warm-up problem. So, if you're doing fraction division, throw something out there at the beginning of class that's kind of related and see what they can do. Give them an experience with the problem before you stand up in front of them and teach them something for the very first time. So at least let them discuss a problem, become familiar with it, and become familiar with the idea of a concept before standing up and saying, okay, keep, change, flip. This is how you do a fraction. This is how you divide fractions. And what I actually started doing, because you asked how much you teach in front of the class and how much you don't, kind of after that, I actually started teaching a lot through video. So anything that I wanted to teach at the front of the class, I would record on an iPad, so I could just like take a picture of a math problem out of the book and write on top of it with my Apple Pencil and record my voice. And that allowed students to kind of work at their own pace. So when it comes to this idea of how much I let the kids struggle, Well, it has to be productive struggle, first of all.
Right.
And then second of all, I really found that differentiating my class via pace completely changed kind of my math education that I was providing for my students. Allowing them to struggle and work through those things at their own pace with my assistance. One thing it did was it freed those students up who succeed to move on without waiting for me and, to be very honest, boring them.
Right.
It allowed me to focus on those students who need the help. So they're struggling, but when they actually need the help, one, I know they need help because I'm gathering formative assessment data. And then second of all, I'm freed up from the front of the class to help. So really my days started turning into students working through self-paced playlists, looking at video, doing some online formative assessment stuff, doing, hands-on collaborative projects around my room, but me really showing up to work every day and just helping kids one-on-one. And so really, that's, I guess my answer is let them struggle, let them work at their own pace. And what I found was even those students who I find are behind everybody else, I think back in my mind, I'm like, wow, Johnny's behind on this playlist and he's not as far as everybody else. But you know what? I really saw Johnny work like 2 whole periods in a row on math on his own, at his own pace. He's working. He's not slacking. He's working. So shouldn't it be okay if he's just behind? Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's just his pace. So I had to get over that, I think. It is the speed thing is, even with mental math, but everybody thinks that mental math needs to be like, oh, that means that you need to be able to tell me 9 times 6 like immediately. Well, mental math just means not, figuring it out in your head, and that might need to take some time. And, giving the room for kids to do math, I think is the first step to having more success with it. Because I think that, the kind of nature of teaching in front of the room with the call and response, the binary nature of that, of the one-to-one and calling on one kid at a time.
Right.
It just isn't making it anymore.
Now, you brought up something that made me think about the typical situation for a math teacher, which is a scripted, very strict curriculum. Especially, I've heard that at higher risk schools, they tend to have this prescribed curriculum that they have to follow, and they have to, do certain lessons on certain days. And what kinds of tips can you give new teachers, especially if they want to do something really creative or outside of the box, but they have to stay, on pace with everyone else, or their students are struggling and they can't keep up, but they have to stay on pace with everyone else? What would you suggest to them?
So I'm going to go ahead and quote my co-host on the Instant Relevance podcast. His name is Mr. Dennis Sheeran. He wrote a book called Instant Relevance, and he likes to say that, when we're just covering a curriculum, that's not teaching. That's just teaching a curriculum, right? That's just getting up and delivering what you're supposed to deliver every single day, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is that setting an expectation for learning in your classroom? You're teaching that human being in front of you. And I know that there are outside stresses to be on a certain pace, or outside stresses to teach a certain way, or outside stresses to, especially to reach a certain like mastery level of students. But my advice to those teachers would be, you're teaching that human being in front of you, and everything you do needs to be student-centered. You're not teaching a curriculum, you're teaching students. And I think that some of the things I've talked about already will give you a little bit more space to do that and to be more successful and not feel like you're just kind of guessing and having some unproductive struggle in your classroom, especially as a teacher. Mm-hmm. So I hope, turning it into a student-centered classroom will help with some of those things. But ultimately, my advice would be, if those people are putting those, or your administration or your district are putting those things upon you, I would go back and say, I'm running a student-centered classroom and I'm teaching students, and I have an expectation for learning not just an expectation to, teach this on this day and run a lecture, because, running a lecture is not teaching, and teaching has changed, and it's changed into what I just described. It's not a surprise to anybody. I think that most districts around the country are, looking at blended learning. There's one-to-ones all over the place. I really doubt that there's any district out there in America that's, there's computers in the classroom and that can help us. I'm pretty sure that everybody's on the ball and knows that these things are there to help us. The question is, how do we utilize them best for us and our students, and keep it focused on the students and not just our own need to get through material for some arbitrary reason.
Now, let's say that I'm, using the model where you have like the small group lesson and students are moving at their own pace, and you have the student who's like unmotivated, they hate math. How do you reach out to those kids?
Well, I think that teaching in general, and especially math teaching, is 100%, or not 100%, but mostly motivational. I think that, part of my job is just become a motivational speaker almost in the classroom. But I also think that those types of things start at day one. I think that setting up the culture in your room as a place for learning, regardless of the difficulties, needs to be a part of your practice. I think from day one, you need to start talking about a growth mindset. I think part of your job as a math teacher these days is also dealing with the negative PR around math that students bring into the classroom, and then also the negative anxiety that kids have about math that they bring into the classroom. So creating a safe space for learning, adopting a growth mindset, also something that, is really great, that really helps with some of these issues is, conferencing, taking some of that small group time, that one-on-one time to set goals with students. Use a product. There's a lot of like portfolio type products like Seesaw for students to kind of track their progress throughout the year. Put work products up there, reflect. I think that all of these things that are kind of associated with kind of goal setting and a growth mindset, if you have those in your classroom, and then you also, keep a positive relationship with math in your classroom, kind of celebrate all those math kind of adjacent activities, bring in kind of the science, and if you have some of those other STEM things going on in your district, bring those in as well. It stinks that as a math teacher, you almost have to be an advocate for the subject, but students are going to know if you're excited about it, and they're going to follow suit.
Right. And they feel your energy too. So if you love math and it's not just like, I didn't have anything else to do but teach math, then same thing with teaching English, because a lot of students think that they suck at reading and writing, and they think that English is going to be this terribly boring class. And they sense my energy and my excitement about it. And so when they're in my class, they may not love reading and writing, but they sure do love being in my class.
Yeah, and those students are usually those students who are good at math and hate reading and writing. I always have the opposite conversation with the ELA teacher. It's like, oh, this kid's great. Oh, this kid's great.
Now, you'd mentioned portfolios. I was curious about, and before you'd also mentioned formative assignments or assessments and gathering formative data. Can you talk a little bit about the different ways that you do that so you can keep track and really get to know your students mathematically?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a product called iExcel that we're, really fortunate to afford in our district, but I think it is pretty common. I think a lot of districts have iExcel, at least for math, but that has kind of a real-time dashboard. Students can work through a particular topic and strive for mastery, which is tracked by a SMART score. And then you can look at your real-time dashboard, and you're kind of given a red placard for a kid if they're struggling and got like 5 wrong in a row. So, keeping track in a real-time situation like that is really powerful, especially with iExcel because there's so many different topics available. But then also I use this product called Go Formative. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but Yeah, so that allows you to take it allows you to do a lot of things, but the one thing I liked was taking an already existing worksheet that I had been using for years, digitizing it, putting up on GoFormative, having the students at least put their answers into the formative to be able to check them instantaneously. And then I had a dashboard that could tell me whether they got them right or wrong or not. So instead of kind of that process of handing a kid a sheet of math problems to do, getting it back, grading it, him getting it back whenever I get it back to him.
Yeah.
That process now turns into that kid doing that worksheet. Every time they do a problem, they check their answer on formative, and I am informed whether they got it right or wrong. So not only do they get the instantaneous academic feedback, but I also, if I see a big line of red and I can see that they've gotten the first 5 wrong, that's a pretty big indicator I need to go talk to that kid. So it also allows me to say, this kid flew through this whole worksheet and got them all right and did a great job on his own. Let's go ahead and extend his learning. So it lets me keep track of learning in a way that I'd never kept track of learning before. And it was, it allowed for some real time information in the classroom that I was never really able to get before.
And that sounds like it makes it really easy too to form small groups based on, students need more instruction on a certain concept. So you can just see everyone who got this particular answer wrong, then you can pull them aside instead of having to bore the whole class with doing a mini lesson.
Absolutely. I mean, the key is to keep yourself flexible in those areas, because it's not always the same kids that are going to need the help. Really, it turned into me having my horseshoe desk and saying, okay, you, and you come up here now, and that being flexible every single day.
Now, do you take any work home, any kind of grading, or is it all happening in real time digitally?
So when I changed my classroom around like that, there's obviously still a decent amount of grading with tests and quizzes and stuff like that. I never was one to want to give an assessment online, like something that would count for, a big test grade. I still think, there's a need kind of for that paper and pencil. Mm-hmm. And once again, it's blended learning. There's still a lot of paper and pencil math going on. So there's projects, there's collaborative problem solving activities. There's always work to be graded. But the thing is that kind of rote, easy to grade thing that would usually bog a math teacher down, that's what can make you more efficient by having a computer do. So that's the piece that it's making you more efficient in the classroom. It's not necessarily taking over, it's just taking that extra practice that would somewhat be rote anyways and kind of taking it off my plate and putting it on in front of the computer.
So what kind of assignments do you want your eyeballs to be looking at so that you can check and see if you need to move on, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So when it's coming to the procedural stuff, like solving an equation, right? They can do that on the computer and the computer can grade that, right? Mm-hmm. But I want to see, not only in a test situation later on, if they can actually apply it in an assessment situation, which really, talks about mastery, but then also I want to see them being able to apply it to a real world situation. So I'm really into project-based learning as well. So, part of what's going on in my classroom is some sort of collaboration as well. So, having different work products for different projects, kind of extending math outside of the classroom. We did a big project on credit card responsibility and kind of financial literacy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So, and some girls made a rap video about credit card with green screen and everything. So, if you open it up for kids to be a little bit more creative as well, in the way that they show mastery, you really do make it a little bit more interesting. You could have a kid, that could definitely sit in front of you and get 100 on that test, right?
Right.
But, can they make their own word problems and then put it together in a 60-second creative Flipgrid or something like that? So it's just with some of those little tweaks in how you're showing mastery, not only can you bump up the rigor and give something for those kind of accelerated kids to really focus on, but also, pump up the excitement as well. And you don't always have to show mastery by putting pencil on paper. There's other options these days as well.
Now, when you started out with teaching math, did you feel like you were constantly planning all the time, and then as time went on, it got a lot easier?
You're going to grow, but it's also going to take work on your part because, I look back and ask myself, how did I get to this stage? How did I get so comfortable teaching math? And well, first of all, it's doing it 10 times because, I taught 10 years.
Yeah.
And, but also, I studied. I mean, my house is filled with math teaching books. It's, I, from day one, have wanted to get better at this job, and it's 100% for the kids. And I wanted to get better since day one. At first it was classroom management. I worked in a hard place and I knew I could be better at it. And I really studied those classroom management techniques and really tried to find out with some of the coaches that I was afforded, how to get better at that. And I did. I would say that's probably one of my best strong points now. But, I went to some books back at the beginning of my career and really studied and researched and tried to figure out, watch videos on the internet of different techniques. I would say Teach Like a Champion is probably one of the best books you could read if you're a beginning teacher. And, really keeping at it and not getting discouraged and having a growth mindset for yourself. Because, you're going to have successes early on as a teacher, but it's not all going to click and it's not all going to make sense. And you're not going to be the best at it almost ever. Like you're probably going to be the best at it the day before you retire.
Right. I agree.
It's a practice. And it's not just a career. It's a practice and it's not just a job. It's something that you're going to want to get better at every single day. And if you're not in that space, then you have to probably ask yourself why you're in it then.
Right. I mean, even I'm at my 17th year now, and I'm still always looking for, okay, how can I teach this better? How can I tweak this lesson from last year? Because I know that they didn't quite get it until I did this. And I like to watch videos of other teachers teaching or go observe my colleagues because I really don't feel like I'm the best that I could be. So I definitely, when I'm coaching new teachers, they're really hard on themselves and they're really, really overwhelmed. A lot of them want to quit teaching within the first few months. They're like, what did I sign up for? There's so much to do. There's so much planning. There's classroom management. How do I do it all? And I tell them, you don't do it all. You don't do it all in the beginning. You have to pace yourself and know that it's going to be imperfect all the time. But that's part of the struggle, is you trying to perfect it as you go.
Right. And for anybody out there, I would say the first thing to focus on is definitely classroom management.
Yes.
I think, and people say that all the time, but there's not the focus on it. I think that you could say that until your face is blue, but then, no one's really teaching these teachers how to be better at classroom management either. It's like, oh, you need to be better at classroom management. And then you're kind of left alone, or, you're not really sure how to make those next steps. And, but I would say, kind of go to the books, go online, watch videos, read Teach Like a Champion, get as many beginning teacher books as possible and really look at those, strategies that they tell you and try them out, and from what I found is, out of all those strategies, the best thing that works is positivity. That's really the best thing that works in a classroom, to be honest. And if you can kind of change some of those negative things in your classroom around to positives and keep a positive voice in your classroom, like instead of saying, oh, Susie, do this, or, Johnny, do that, you can go around and say, oh, Sam, I really like how you're doing this, or, Laura, I really like how you're doing that. And then all of a sudden everybody's doing what you want them to do.
Right.
So, those types of small shifts in tone and voice and the way that you speak to kids mean the world, and they're slight. And it has a lot to do with like psychology and human emotion and emotional intelligence. As a teacher, you are needing to be an expert in human emotion, and you need to be really high on the emotional intelligence kind of spectrum. And if you're not, and that's not something that is a strong suit for you, then that needs to change.
You need to develop that for sure.
Yeah.
And it's also something that I've found is you have to be pretty strong in yourself and in your own like self-worth and self-esteem. If you get butthurt from the littlest thing, or you get offended because a 13-year-old said they don't like your outfit, or you flinch or show fear, or that you're about to cry, and I feel bad because there are a lot of teachers who genuinely feel this way. You got to get over that, because they're going to eat you alive. I don't care how good the kids are, what neighborhood you teach in, they're going to eat you alive.
Yep. And that's the funny thing is, you say, no matter what neighborhood you teach in. I mean, I've taught in inner city Chicago, and I've taught in rural Rhode Island. And in both places, you need to be good at classroom management. 7th grade class is going to eat you alive in both places.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that you co-host another podcast. Can I make a guess and say that it has to do with math?
Well, it's two math teachers. It's myself and Dennis Sheeran, who is the author of Instant Relevance, and then also the author, I believe, of a book called Hacking Mathematics. We are two math teachers, or at least now we're both administrators or in some administrative role. And so we're former math teachers. So it's not about math. It's about, lots of different subjects, but it's about making learning relevant for all students. And Dennis really likes these instant relevant moments where we can say, oh, this is something going on in the news, and we can bring this into the classroom, and here's a bunch of ways that we could apply it kind of to whatever subject you're talking about. And, really bringing the outside world into the classroom and really making teaching more relevant in many different ways. We talk about kind of a lot of the things we've talked about already here, but really with this lens of making learning relevant for the kids in front of us and keeping things student-centered. So it's been pretty successful so far, I guess. We've had about 8 episodes. We're just getting started. We've had some good guests. We're getting out there. We've got some people booked up that are good. We're starting to put it out every week instead of every other week. So it's been really fun, though. I've really had a good time doing it.
So when you're talking about taking things that are happening and how they have relevance to what we're learning, do you guys do a lot of like making connections and analogies with, what we learn in our just typical textbooks, like history textbooks and, novels that English teachers would be reading?
Yeah, so that's one part of it is, taking things outside of, the traditional textbook and saying, oh, this thing happened in football and there's a statistic related with football. Let's really bring that in and we could talk about that, from a math perspective, or even we could do that, maybe even in some other classes if we really think outside of the box a little bit more.
You had mentioned, going out and reaching out to other teachers. If my listeners want to get a hold of you and pick your brain, where can they find you?
A lot of different places. So I am on Twitter. I'm at blended_math. I started a website called blendedlearningmath.com. Anybody can go there for more kind of even grade level resources on blending your math classroom. I also have written quite a bit. So I have a regular column on eschoolnews.com about my classroom. I also write for Education Post. I usually write like policy pieces for them. I have a plus policy fellowship right now that got me hooked up with writing for them.
Oh, nice.
And then I also, if you're a parent, I write for Fatherly. I don't know if you know Fatherly. It's a millennial dad's like website. So
nice.
I've written about like exercise, but I've also written about like math homework as well. So blendedlearningmath.com is kind of a hub for all my work. You can check there. Reach out to me. I love talking about this stuff. I have a podcast. I have Twitter. I have a website. As you can imagine, I'm pretty easy to get a hold of.
Awesome. And I'll definitely put those links in the show notes for those of you that would like to get a hold of Ray. Well, Ray, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So I know you guys got a lot out of that episode. Like I said in the beginning, in the introduction, Ray really did a deep dive into several topics that do apply to math, but they also could apply to other subjects. So one thing that really stuck out to me about what Ray talked about was how Common Core is a lot more rigorous than it used to be with just regular state standards. He talked about how the standards were pushed down from the upper levels into the elementary school. So math is more rigorous and it's harder, but the way that he described it, math is also more applicable, relevant, and meaningful for students. So while we as parents may not understand how math is done this way, if your child started with the Common Core in kindergarten, this is actually just business as usual, and it allows students to learn multiple ways to attack a problem. It's more about strategies rather than just drill and kill math. Another thing that really stuck out to me that Ray discussed was how to personalize education so that you could give the appropriate interventions for students. So he did talk about a flipped learning model where he records videos and the students watch that and they sort of go at their own pace. And I think that's a fabulous way to ensure that those students that need the extra time, they get it, while the students who are able to do this, they don't need to wait for their peers to catch up. They can actually extend their learning and get the enrichment that they need. Finally, Ray and I go in depth with advice for teachers on how to make teaching a little bit easier and more manageable in those first few years. So we discuss, classroom management, and we discuss planning and mindset. And I think it's really important that in the beginning, with those first 3 to 5 years, that new teachers, you guys, my listeners, you have to go easy on yourself. You can't expect that you're going to be able to do all the things, and that you should definitely focus on classroom management. And you probably hear that a lot, and there's a good reason for that. And then everything else you'll eventually get, and it'll fall into place. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Teachers Need Teachers podcast. Again, I appreciate you coming out. I would love it if you guys would take a minute to subscribe. Just go ahead and hit that subscribe button on whichever podcast player you're listening on. I personally love to listen on Spotify. And so if you follow, then all of my episodes will automatically pop up and you can listen to them every single Monday. And if you have any questions, or if you'd like to be on the show, or maybe there's something that you feel that I need to talk about on the podcast, please email me at kim@teachersneedteachers.com. Thanks, and have a fabulous week.
Thanks for listening to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast. Love this episode? Head over to Apple Podcast or Google Play to subscribe, rate, and leave a review.